This headline gave me a belly laugh. Online store condemned as irresponsible for selling Breaking Bad meth sweets. It was from a British news site. I am a real fan of the AMC series Breaking Bad, and the sniffy tone of the article gave me a lot of pleasure, which is why I was laughing. Pleasure is what this lecture is all about. For the two of you on Earth who have not heard about the series, Breaking Bad was a television show that ended in the fall of 2013. It's centered around a chemistry teacher who becomes a drug dealer, hence the title, making a highly purified form of methamphetamine. The color of the meth is blue, sky blue. As the show ended, many people I know seemed to suffer withdrawal symptoms. To ease the pain, some entrepreneurial types found they could make a rock candy that looked just like the chemistry teacher's meth. They began selling it online. Shops in Albuquerque popped up where you could buy the same thing. The internet got involved, naturally, and there were, and are, recipes about how to make it yourself, floating in cyberspace for eternity. Some people are chuckling all the way to the bank. This show illustrated several aspects of the experience of pleasure worth noting, some good, some bad, and in this lecture we're going to talk about both. I will divide this discussion journey into two parts. Part one concerns the lighter side of pleasure, starting with definitions, moving to evolutionary significance and some neurobiology. Part two concerns the darker side of pleasure, examining the biology behind addiction. The practical application discusses how to use pleasure to break bad habits and form new ones. If you've got your police scanners on, let's get started. I remember getting hooked on Breaking Bad virtually from its opening shot. Walter is in his underwear in the New Mexico desert, video selfing what appears to be his last message to a very beloved family. There's an old RV, two guys lying dead on the floor. There is a growing sound of police sirens and an urgency to the music that made my brain stick to the screen. What's not to love? Well, there was lots to love, it turned out. The show was already giving me pleasure, or at least interest, in its opening frames. What was going on in my brain? What does pleasure mean to a neuroscientist? I loved the script writing of the show, also pleasurable. Meth, the show's real star, gives a wicked form of pleasure, both as a drug and as a plot element. I like looking at sunsets, of which Breaking Bad had plenty. Are well-written TV shows and methamphetamine-induced highs and sunsets all the same thing neurologically? Or are there different kinds of pleasure? How does one separate pleasure from happiness? What is the evolutionary significance of pleasure? Definitions of pleasure are admittedly hard to come by. And you won't be surprised by this, not everybody agrees about what pleasure is. Researchers use words like hedonic motivation to describe the phenomenon, and also words like positive reaction. Pleasure is defined as specific positive reactions to certain experiences. Hedonic motivation, well, that's the desire to experience those positive reactions. Pleasure-seeking, according to some researchers, is amongst our most basic drives, right up there with pain avoidance. Some researchers believe pleasure is actually a continuum of experiences ranging from like to ecstasy. As with our discussion of memory, pleasure is not a unitary phenomenon. Researcher Kent Berridge believes multiple brain systems are involved in processing various types of pleasure. Multiple brain systems imply a lot of evolutionary interest. If we define pleasure as specific positive reactions to certain experiences, we can ask an important question. What evolutionary advantage is there to devoting such a large neurological space to it? A hint as to pleasure's Darwinian roots may be found in the one central fact about pleasure. Regardless of definition, if we find activity X pleasurable, we usually want to repeat activity X. This is not because we like activity X, it's because we like the pleasure activity X gives us. This repetition characteristic means that pleasure has a powerful ability to shape our behaviors. It can motivate us to behave in specific ways and motivate us to stop behaving in other ways. But in the pursuit of what? In the cold, predictable world of Darwin, that answer's actually easy: to survive long enough to pass along our genes. Human sexual behavior represents a good example of how pleasure can shape behavior in the pursuit of a survival goal. Let's explore the motivations for sex for a minute, something that in the early episodes Breaking Bad was very good at depicting. We begin with the following fact. The odds are stacked against us for getting pregnant, and we used pleasure to beat the odds. Consider 3 obstacles to human reproduction. Obstacle number 1. Human females are only fertile a few days a month, rarely with more than 1 egg available at ovulation. 1 tiny egg in 1 small window of time to save the race. Obstacle number 2. The menstrual train works on a staggered schedule. Not all females come into fertility at the same time each month. This has the uncomfortable consequence of not being able to predict when a female is reproductively competent. Obstacle number 3. Females don't have lots of outward signs of their fertility. If you're an old world female chimpanzee, your backside swells to a swollen pink mass so that it looks like a bad case of hemorrhoids. You've probably seen this in the zoos. In the wacky world of non-human primates, that swelling is reproductive, a sign of sexual receptivity. She's becoming fertile and the world gets to know all about it. We don't have anything like that sexual swelling to signal our fertility. Our cues, if we have them at all, are surprisingly subtle. So, how are we going to reproduce successfully given 1 egg, a few days out of the month, and no clue about when we're ready? The answer to that question is the answer to why, from an evolutionary perspective, we have pleasure systems at all. Let me explain that last sentence, starting with our monthly numbers. If you don't know when you're fertile, the best strategy would be to have lots of sex throughout the month. Be available all the time, rain or shine, any time of the year. If enough sex occurred between enough people, enough days during the month, you could be virtually assured of a few pregnancies. So, what is the best way to make someone want to do the same thing over and over again? Well, make it pleasurable. That's how. Make it so positive that someone will repeatedly engage in the behavior just to get the pleasure. If sex were made aversive, say we got a toothache every time we mated, there probably wouldn't be very many pregnancies. If sex were made physically neutral, say like a yawn, we might get an occasional pregnancy. But if sex were made very compelling, pleasurable, remember the core ingredient about pleasurable experiences is that we like to repeat them, then we were more likely to get pregnant per unit time. In this view, pleasure serves as a pleasant goad with an important purpose: survival. Pleasure has some powerful evolutionary reasons to exist. In fact, you could say in a quite literal sense, our existence depends upon it. I remember getting a birthday card from my wife that illustrates these concepts nicely. The front of the card pictured a pleasant woman being pampered. The caption reads, "How to impress a woman. Love her, compliment her, Respect her, honor her, cuddle her, caress her, listen to her, care for her, hold her, go to the ends of the earth for her. When you turned the page of the card, however, you got a very different picture. Now we have a slovenly guy with a big smile on his face. The caption read, "How to impress a man. Show up naked, bring beer." We laughed at this sexist card until we cried. Lots of pleasure there and some success. We now have 2 children. So, what are the brain regions behind such delightful experiences? As I mentioned, there are many distributed regions throughout the brain involved. We'll have time to examine only 2 of the most prominent regions. Get ready for some big words. One region is called the nucleus accumbens. The other is called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The nucleus accumbens is a little knot of neural tissue just above your eyes, about 1/3 of the way into your brain. You have 2 of them, one on either side of the midline. Don't let this small size fool you. The nucleus helps mediate some of the best feelings in the human experience, and some of the worst. You laugh in part because of the nucleus accumbens. When you feel rewarded for doing something good, blame it on the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens helps mediate your feelings of pleasure. The nucleus accumbens doesn't mediate these complex behaviors by itself. It has many partners, including that second region we mentioned, the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The VTA lies behind the nucleus accumbens and a little below it. It's also important in the processing of pleasure, particularly in detecting rewards. But it has other functions. The VTA is usually alerted if the brain sees something unusual, so it's also part of our attentional apparatus. These regions, the accumbens and the VTA, communicate with each other by way of a neural highway, which you can think of as a kind of a pleasure road for the brain. How these 2 regions make experiences pleasurable is explained in part by a very precious biochemical cargo that traffics between them. Together, these cells, plus this cargo, produce some of the most powerful, pleasurable feelings you can experience. Like I said, and some of the worst, which I also said, but I haven't yet mentioned at all, but I'm about to. We obviously need to talk about that cargo on Pleasure Road, and not necessarily in a nice way. We're going to hurtle headlong into the world of addiction, starting with a video game, then moving to one of the most famous, and I might add saddest, experiments in all of neuroscience. We're about to enter the dark side of pleasure. I admit getting hooked on the video game Candy Crush Saga, and I blame it all on Pleasure Road. It's in a class of games I like to call mindless things to do while waiting at airport security lines. Candy Crush is fun, at least at first. You get lots of positive rewards for accomplishing the game's goals, seeing words like sweet and tasty and wonderful and divine. These are great depictions of candy, a few colored like blue meth. The cartoon hosts are happy and smiling and cuddly. The game is so relentlessly positive, it's almost like playing a game with Disneyland. But it's not trivial. The levels alternate between easy and insanely hard. Some levels are so difficult, you must play them many times to get the goal. You burn through lives every time you do. It's a lot of fun. One day, however, I hit a wall. There came a time when I ran out of lives. That's usually not a problem with games like these. You usually just tank up with more lives and carry on. That's exactly what Candy Crush does not allow you to do. To my complete surprise, rather than letting me start over, the screen suddenly showed a small heart with a tearful, sad face. A sad face in Candy Crush. And it read, "No more lives. Time to next life, 30 minutes. It then displayed a countdown timer. I couldn't believe it. I could no longer play my vexing level for 30 minutes to continue my pleasure. Suddenly, I craved to play Candy Crush. I'm an American. I don't wait for anything, especially for video confections. Yet it forced me to wait 30 frickin' minutes. When the time was up, I rushed to the game, anxious to continue. I couldn't wait to play. What I discovered was that the game was putting its hooks in me. I was becoming mildly addicted, or at least wanting more fun time. The next time I ran into a wall, I had to wait again, and I looked forward to playing it even more. Candy Crush isn't exactly like methamphetamine. Nonetheless, I got in touch with the dark side of pleasure. For some people, video games are addicting. You want the pleasure buzz, and you want it now. What exactly does it mean to have a pleasure buzz? What molecules mediate the experience? Let's go back to Pleasure Road, the neural circuits that connect the nucleus accumbens with the VTA. You might recall I said, quote, "How these two regions make experiences pleasurable is explained in part by a very precious biochemical cargo that traffics between them," close quote. Okay, it's time for me to explain that precious cargo. The cargo is the famous molecule dopamine. You've probably heard of dopamine before. The nucleus accumbens uses dopamine to mediate its electrical signaling to the VTA. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a molecule we described way back in lecture number 4. It's one of the excitatory neurotransmitters. That is, its function stimulates nerve cells into action as opposed to inhibiting them. Dopamine follows the normal course of any neurotransmitter. The presynaptic cell releases dopamine into the synaptic cleft. The dopamine travels across the cleft to the neighboring postsynaptic cell where it binds to a receptor, stimulating it into action. The dopamine is released. It winds its way back to its neural origin in a process known as reuptake. Dopamine is sometimes called the feel-good molecule, but that's a trifle misleading. Dopamine is involved in a bewildering number of behaviors. The neurotransmitter is involved in learning and memory formation. It's also involved in emotional arousal and feeling pain and motor activity. Its deregulation can have severe consequences. If you make too much of it, you might get schizophrenia. This idea is actually called the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. Make too little of it, and you might suffer the fate of Michael J. Fox. Dopamine deficiencies in specific areas of the brain cause Parkinson's disease. In addition to its function of mediating pleasure, it's also involved in the ability to coordinate muscle movement. Fox, a popular actor, was diagnosed with the disease at a relatively young age and has become an advocate for research and treatment. Phew. That's a lot of heavy lifting for a tiny little molecule. Like I said, it does a bewildering number of things. One of its most insidious functions is the role it plays in addictive behavior and how powerfully we can be drawn to pleasure when overstimulated. This toxic effect can be illustrated by one of the most heartbreakingly familiar experiments in all of brain science. It was first designed in the lab of James Olds. This was its basic design. A. Tiny metal electrodes were inserted into the nucleus accumbens of a lab rat, allowing the region to be stimulated electrically. B. The electrode apparatus was connected to a bar in the cage. Every time the animal pressed the bar, electricity flowed through the electrode, stimulating the nucleus accumbens. Since the region mediates pleasure, every time the rat pressed the lever, the animal experienced pleasure. How do the animals behave who are rigged up to this contraption? Here's the startling answer, folks. They die. Not because of the electricity, because of the feelings the electricity induces. The pleasure is so intense, the rat wants more. He presses the bar over and over again to get his goodie. Pretty soon, that's all he does. The animal stops eating. He stops drinking. Bar pressing is now the only thing important in his life, and he dies of exhaustion. Given the choice to live or feel pleasure, the rat chooses pleasure. This landmark study provided many great insights into the addictive side of Pleasure Road. The nucleus accumbens electrically stimulates the VTA with dopamine. The molecular cargo. You feel pleasure as a result. If you stimulate it too much, really bad things can happen. Chief amongst these will be the experience of addiction, and it is to addiction that we now turn. Put simply, addiction is the state of behavioral dependence on a chemical substance or activity. We're going to focus on the substance abuse side for the sake of brevity, focusing particularly on crack cocaine. But it should be noted that some behaviors, such as an addiction to gambling, show the same hallmarks of addictive behavior. They may even involve some of the same neurological processes as chemical addictions. And just what are those hallmarks and processes? There are three big ones. Craving. The most obvious characteristic of addiction is an intense craving for a particular substance, often after casual use. In the case of crack cocaine, the high comes very quickly, a high so pleasurable that most people want more of the drug as soon as the high subsides, which is soon, for the high only lasts a few minutes. Cravings set in within the first hour after ingestion. It's been reliably measured 10 minutes later. As the days and weeks go by, you consume more of it in an attempt to repeat the initial buzz. Number two, tolerance. Tolerance is defined as a reduction over time of the ability of a drug's regular dosage to get you high. After a while, you have to take more of the drug to get a buzz. The high becomes less and less intense, so you begin consuming more of the drug, attempting to reestablish the pleasure. Eventually, the drug no longer gets you high. You have to take it just to feel normal, just to function, and to avoid what is the third characteristic of addictive behavior, and that is withdrawal symptoms. The drug's most insidious characteristic comes from the fact that, over time, your body switches from pleasure-seeking to aversion avoidance. You begin to experience withdrawal if you can't ingest the drug. Now you're not looking to the drug for a buzz. You're looking to the drug for survival. Now the substance has you in its claw. In the case of cocaine, you can get depressed, even suicidal, fatigued, hostile, anxious, paranoid, violent, homicidal, and equipped with such a craving to get more of the stuff that nothing else in life seems to matter. And if you finally do get more stuff, you have to take such a large dosage that it can become life-threatening. One of the most powerful examples of what drugs like cocaine can do comes from studies with monkeys. The animals are hooked up to a bar. When pressed, they will get an intravenous dose of cocaine. It's similar to the rat story. I'm going to let Sidney Cohen, quoted in a paper in a psychiatric journal, explain. It should sound very familiar. Quote, animals will work more avidly by pressing a bar repetitively to obtain an intravenous fix for cocaine than any other drug. In an unlimited access situation, monkeys will self-administer cocaine by bar pressing for it until they die. In one study, primates bar pressed 12,800 times in order to get a single dose of cocaine. They will work for cocaine in preference to food, even though they're starving. They will continue to bar press even though a receptive female is in their cage. They will prefer an electric shock in order to obtain a large dose of cocaine, despite the fact that they could have received a lesser dose without a shock. Wow. All monkeys respond in this compulsive manner. If humans had unlimited access to cocaine, they probably would behave in a similar way. Close quote. Tragically, we already know they do. This story should sound familiar, like Jim Old's experiment, the one where he put electrodes into the nucleus accumbens and watched the rat have the same bar-pressing, life-sapping behavior. Yet the monkey experiment did not involve stimulating the nucleus accumbens. It simply involved administering cocaine. Is there a link between addictive behaviors like cocaine and Pleasure Road? The answer is yes. Researchers have used data like these to discover, in broad outlines, the biology behind the addictive behaviors you see in substance abuse issues. We know 4 things. We know that the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, is deeply involved in the initial phases of setting up cocaine addiction. We know the nucleus accumbens, which the VTA targets, helps mediate the pleasure responses to the drugs, just like it mediates pleasure responses to a sunset. We know that both regions and the neural circuits that connect them traffic in dopamine. We know that drug abuse overdrives these systems, releasing massive quantities of dopamine into their circuitry, turning Pleasure Road into highway to hell. The buzz is so powerful you stop wanting sunsets, you only want to get high. The highway is not the whole story behind the neurobiology of addictions, of course. Human addictive behavior, just like human pleasure behavior, involves many complex cellular and molecular processes, from memory systems in the temporal lobes to the decision-making centers in the frontal cortex. But the role the highway to hell plays is profound. It's impressive that our 2 great drives, the will to survive and the will to reproduce, can be completely quashed in primates simply to get the drug. Now, cocaine isn't the only substance that uses the highway to hell. Almost every addictive drug you can think of uses it, including one we haven't mentioned, alcohol. It's probably the most commonly abused substance on the planet, and perhaps the one with the greatest longevity. Alcoholics have been around us for centuries, and perhaps because of its familiarity, its conspicuous consumption is more socially acceptable than, say, cocaine. A humorous example of this social acceptance and conspicuous consumption occurred fairly recently in a research journal. A group of British scientists studied the drinking habits of fictional character James Bond. Yes, Ian Fleming's British spy, then published their findings. They read each book Fleming wrote about Mr. Bond, all 14, marking every alcoholic drink he consumed. Bond's drink of choice is, of course, the shaken, not stirred vodka martini. What they found was amazing. From the 88 days in which he could take a drink, only 13 of those were alcohol-free. Though he never swam with the fishes, he drank like the fishes, consuming a whopping 92 standard alcohol units every 7 days. Just to give an example of what that means, a pint of beer, is 2 units, ditto for a 6-ounce glass of wine. He would score in the alcoholic range on a standard alcohol consumption questionnaire. The conclusion is that James Bond shouldn't even be standing. At that level of consumption, his brain would be severely damaged, his hands permanently shaking. He may not have been able to hold a gun, let alone aim it. He could not perform sexually. The article is entitled, quote, "Were James Bond's drinks shaken because of alcohol-induced tremor?" Close quote. The authors actually predict Bond would be an impotent drunk. Oh, and he would die early, probably of a heart attack. The infographic accompanying the article was appropriately named, "James Bond is the man with the golden liver." We're now going to talk about the practical applications of understanding the effects of pleasure on behavior. Thankfully, we'll move away from the sad addictions of alcohol and cocaine and talk about more minor bad habits, ones more annoying than tragic, like getting you to work out more or to stop yelling at drivers on the road. What we'll find is an interesting contradiction. Pleasure can be the source of bad habits. but it's equally good at getting rid of them. Many programs exist claiming to get rid of these annoying bad habits. Some work, some don't. There's a common mechanism behind the most effective ones. It has to do with positive reinforcement. It's actually a two-step process. Let's say you have two behaviors. One you want to remove, one you want to cultivate. The one you want to remove could be anything. Lack of exercise, inconsistent study habits, yelling at drivers on the freeway. Let's call it behavior A. The other habit is the one you want to replace it with. Perhaps getting more exercise, persistent study hours, and not yelling while driving. Let's call it behavior B. The goal is to replace minor annoying behavior A with major wonderful behavior B. We actually know the most effective way to do this. The fastest way to learn a new behavior is to continuously reward yourself for the new behavior every time you do it. You work out, then immediately read a favorite poem or go see a movie. Every time you do the new behavior, you remunerate yourself in some fashion, continuously and no exceptions. Soon the new behavior becomes part of your lifestyle. You look forward to it. Not because you want the behavior, but because you want the goodie that goes with it. We call this style of reward schedule continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is not a panacea, unfortunately. Research shows behaviors established by continuous reward schedules don't have much stick-to-itiveness. Behavior B goes away soon after you stop rewarding it. Now you're back to your old nasty behavior A. So, what to do? Employ the second step of this advice. If the goal is to make a permanent change, you'll eventually need to switch rewarding schedules. You will need to change to something we call partial reinforcement. Once new behavior B is up and running, you start slowing down the reward schedule. You allow yourself a goodie with less and less frequency. You still do the same amount of exercise, but the reward is no longer continuous. That's why it's called partial reinforcement. Research shows this two-step process, switching from continuous to partial, is very powerful when consistently applied. The good behavior will eventually become established without need for reward. Behavior B becomes familiar, behavior A becomes history, and you become happy. Did I just say happy? What in the world do I mean by happy? Is that different from pleasure? Most researchers think so, a fact we'll explore in our very next lecture. So you can sort of think of this as lecture part 1 of a 2-part series. Stay tuned. I think you will like happy better than addictions, even if you're still a fan of Breaking Bad.